In our last lesson, we discussed standard three-part counterpoint using the species approach. Apart from adding dominant seventh chords to our harmonic vocabulary, there's nothing very unusual here. In this lesson, we'll add some rarer varieties of species counterpoint that are nonetheless very useful. In fact, they bring the student much closer to real-life counterpoint. There are various traditions of species counterpoint, depending which country and which teacher you have. Since species counterpoint is, by definition, not a style-based way of learning, these varieties are neither good nor bad in themselves. What makes the difference is how much effort the teacher puts into explaining issues of musical judgment, and also whether the teacher connects the whole approach to actual musical composition. One extension of the species approach is the idea of combined species. By this we mean having each line on a different species. For example, apart from the cantus and whole notes, one part could be in third species and another in fourth species. Of the three possible combinations in three parts, the least interesting is that of second and fourth species together. Although it can be a useful challenge, it doesn't resemble many real-life situations. However, when one part is moving steadily in quarter notes and the other added part is slower, second or fourth species, we see for the first time what I call stratified counterpoint. Each layer has its own rhythmic character. This is often seen in the standard repertoire. For example, many pieces by Bach, based on Lutheran chorales, have the chorale and long notes, while one or two other parts move steadily in a different rhythm, and a fourth part makes another rhythmic plane. Here's our first example, third species combined with second species. What's particular in this kind of counterpoint is the way accented passing tones or neighbor notes on the third beat can now enrich the texture. There are examples here in measures 3, 7, and 8. There are also cases where the second half note and the third quarter note combine to gently suggest another chord, for example in measure 2 and measure 4. In measure 2, the harmony seems to be E minor at the start of the bar, but the second half note, C, is consonant with both the bass and the upper part, so there's a momentary suggestion of a C major sixth chord. Is the C in the tenor a chord tone or a passing note? It's both, and the result is quite rich. In measure 4, the D in the soprano makes a third with the B in the tenor, sounding momentarily like a seventh chord. Since it's part of a rising scale and in a weak rhythmic position, it doesn't really need a resolution, but the overall effect is definitely richer. When there are two dissonances at the same time in the two moving voices, if possible, make them consonant with each other. For example, in measure 6, the D and the B are both passing notes, but the sixths they form together adds richness. Now another example, this time combining third species with fourth species. The 7/8 suspension in relation to the cantus, which we mostly avoided in two parts, here is used in measure 3. The presence of the C in the third part makes the overall result rich enough. Again, it's a good idea to try and arrange things when possible, so that the third species part sounds rich with the suspension's resolution. Apart from measure 3, notice measure 2. The F implies a momentary dominant seventh. Measure 5, the F is rich with the D. Measure 7, the D on the third beat in the alto part reinstates the C just left in the bass. And finally, measure 8, which is once again a passing dominant seventh. Since the third species line is the one with the most flexibility, the composer can usually find a way to aim for the richest possible note. As we mentioned above, the combination of second and fourth species is somewhat less interesting, but there's one more possibility in three parts, which is even more like real-life composition. Both the added parts can be written in fifth species at the same time. Here's an example. This example brings up a problem we haven't discussed yet, which occurs all the time in real composition, balancing the rhythmic activity of several independent parts. As we've already mentioned in previous lessons, the listener can't pay equal attention to multiple planes at the same time. When the music is a simple accompanied melody, there's no question about which line is primary. When the texture is contrapuntal, interest can move between parts instead of always staying in the same place. Properly managed, this can add great richness to the texture, even in situations that are not explicitly contrapuntal. In this example, notice that the only time both fifth species parts move together in quarter notes for more than one beat at a time is the end. Since the end is an appropriate place for increasing momentum, this makes sense. On the other hand, once the quarter notes start, they're pretty much constant until the end, but not always in the same part. This creates rhythmic differentiation between the parts. In other words, the cockroach rule, once we build up momentum, it's hard to stop it within a phrase without being disappointed, applies here as well, but overall, not in any one part. Notice also how the suspensions in measure 4, 5, and 8 smooth out the rhythm and create harmonic richness. All the lines here peak relatively close to the beginning. In the case of the alto, this is pretty much unavoidable since the soprano moves steadily down. However, the bass, up to and including the first note of measure 3, could just as easily be transposed down an octave to postpone its peak. Melodically, either version makes sense. Measure 5, we introduce something not yet seen, 2 harmonies in one bar. When there are 2 parts in fifth species, and one of them is in the bass, this can happen, as long as both chords are coherent in relation to the cantus. Of course, the moving parts must agree on the harmony, in this case 5-4-2 going to 1-6. This combination, 2 fifth species lines at the same time, also allows for accents to passing tones, for example, measure 1 in the bass on the third beat of the bar. All these things will become more and more frequent as we continue. Here's another example of 2 fifth species lines at the same time. The peaks are not simultaneous. Notice the accent to passing tone in the middle of measure 4, and the ornamental resolution of the suspension in measure 5, the 2 lines in quarter notes in measure 6 and measure 8. When both parts are in quarter notes like this, it's important that they don't start and stop at the same time. Here the bass is non-stop quarter notes from measure 5 to the end, whereas the soprano is rhythmically more varied. In our next lesson, we move on to 4 parts, and then we'll be leaving the whole note cantate behind for good. Remember, aim for rich intervals between the 2 moving parts on the third beat. In fifth species, balance the quarter note activity between the parts, work 4 or 5 bars at a time, sing and play.